It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the irreplaceable John Hersey and the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably John Hersey. How you doing this morning, John?
I'm good. It's a blustery spring day here. We're getting some flakes, and I think it's as good a day as ever. A cold day to talk about a cold-hearted sob. How are you doing today,
That's
Andy?
I'm no, I'm good, John. No, that's a good point because we have a special edition version of the show today, as this would be our second villain show. The first one back in Halloween, of course, was I wasn't going to say celebrate Karl Marx, but it was devoted, focused on Karl Marx. And here on Earth Day, one of Marx's leading proteges, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known to the world as Lenin, one of the most egregious mass murderers in history. So this is a special edition of the Villain Show, everybody. Of April 22nd, it's very fitting to discuss Lenin on April 22nd, isn't it, John?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, today is Earth Day, and the first ever Earth Day in 1970 was the 100th anniversary of Lenin's birth. So, speculation there about whether or not that's a coincidence, but a lot of people think it is. And given the obvious connections between the leftism of the early and enduring environmentalist movement and Lenin, it wouldn't surprise me at all to learn that this was a very conscious decision.
Yeah, I've read a number of sources over the years that said the founders of Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970, picked it deliberately because it was Lenin's birthday. But I don't know for sure. But you're absolutely right. The leftist Marxist politics, of the environmentalist movement and of Lenin are very similar. So I guess we could start off, as we've already noted. Lenin's dates are 1870 to 1924, born on April 22nd, 18. There he is. He's not going to win any beauty contests, is he, John? What a mug.
No, I like how you put it. A face like a clenched fist.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, a lot of these Soviet mass murderers look like that. I remember, when I was a kid, seeing on TV or in the newspapers the pictures of these guys, on May Day. They're all lined up watching the Soviet tanks roll past the Kremlin. You see whoever it was, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, or these guys. They all had that look. You could just see it. That face was just filled, with brutality. They were brutalized, and they were mass murderers. And Lenin is the initiator of this in Russia. And interesting that he came out of a prosperous middle class family. You know,
Yeah, they
uh,
become the kingpin of a Russian mob essentially, and he had a pretty well off childhood. I mean, this is kind of interesting given that he supposedly championed the plight of the poor, but really had very little experience with poverty in his own life. He was disturbed child from an early age, but you wouldn't have known this until recently when they cracked the classified files. I mean, for decades, children in Russia learned to proclaim their love of Lenin before they did their own parents. And there was a whole category of children's literature, kind of like the Parson Weems myth of the cherry tree for George Washington. There was this story told about young Lenin breaking his mother's favorite carafe, and he was so guilty he couldn't sleep. And so, moral exemplar that boy Lenin is supposed to be, he, in the middle of the night one night, ran and told his parents, this is I did this, and then they congratulated him for his honesty. But in fact, he was a pretty disturbed young man. He was a headbanger. He used to bash his head against the wall. and he was very nasty to his parents and siblings, even from a
Yeah, well,
young age. It's
not a surprise, is it? And and we
not
should
at all.
point out here, yeah, we should point out here that Marxism and communism generally appeal to the intelligentsia, and the middle class. Sometimes you'll rouse the workers with Marxism, but it's generally the an educated intellectual elite that that Marxism appeals to. National Socialism, well, Nazism has that power to galvanize the masses. You see, they're preaching, Nazis are preaching race war, and to a primitive type mentality, you could visually see, the difference of different races, or different ethnic groups, or different tribes. And by the way, one episode of the Villain Show in the future, maybe at Halloween, we'll need to do Adolf Hitler. But
Absolutely.
the yeah, that primitive mentality, that caveman mentality, National Socialism galvanizes them, and the Nazis sweep the gutters of these thugs. They recruit them, in the stormtroopers. But the Marxism appeals to the intelligentsia and the upper middle class, and the reason for that is Marx, as Ayn Rand pointed out, and and I think other people as well. Marxism is as false as anything could be. They're preaching inveterate class warfare, but it's very theoretical. It's a philosophy, and so the racism. You could just visualize. You could see it at the observation level. But to understand the international working class is in conflict with the international owning class, that's a much higher level theory and appeals to, much higher level intellects, however disturbed they may be. And you're right, Lenin comes out of a prosperous family. His parents were well educated. He's well educated, and Marx's father was a lawyer. He got a PhD, and Marx got a PhD in philosophy from one of the German universities. And this is typical of Marxists. So yeah, I think intelligent, educated, and deeply disturbed. There's the recipe. There's the recipe for a Marxist.
Yeah, Lenin was constantly betting on these proletarian uprisings to basically champion socialism and communism. And every single time, I mean, he was always wrong, or almost always wrong. And more often than not, he was actually quelling rebellions of people rising up against him, and for good reason, as we'll get into. But when he came to power, the Soviet, by the way, this refers to council, and the Soviets were these councils of elected workers and sometimes soldiers that were elected on a local, regional basis to sort of direct politics for their area. And he made a big deal of, okay, we're the Communist Party and Sovnarkom, his government. We're going to team up with these Soviets, but very, very quickly, I think within a year of taking power, it basically marginalized the Soviets and taken away all of their power. And he said that so what's going to bring the communist revolution is not a bunch of not a socialist culture of a bunch of semi-educated workers and peasants. It's going to be this intelligentsia, these elites. But
Right.
he was I mean, pretty intellectual guy, and I think this in large part comes from his father, who actually did experience poverty. His father was part of the peasantry, but he was very ambitious. He studied math and physics, and eventually became a professor at Pensa Institute for the Nobility, and he was even brought into the nobility and honored. His parents both championed the classical liberalism, or the classical liberal principles that Tsar Alexander II brought to the table. He was sort of a more forward-thinking czar, and unfortunately, his predecessors were less so. And even he sort of, in his lifetime, backed down from his most liberty-minded principles. But Lenin came from this pretty wealthy family. They holidayed at this rural manor. He grew up, he enjoyed playing chess and hiking. He really liked the outdoors. And some would say that he was a formidable intellect. And I think that if he was, it definitely comes from, or I would presume that that's in part to do with his father, who was this very respected educator, became a regional director for public schools, and died Lenin was still very young. He was 15 years old when his father died of a brain hemorrhage, and we've got to wonder, his father, far better politically than the son, uh, more of a disciplinarian. We've got to wonder what the world might be like had he not died so young, but
Yeah,
was not to
that's
be the case.
that's true. Who knows what might have happened? Things might have been much better. But you're absolutely right about what an autocrat Lenin was. If in fact, later on when the the socialist communist cell that he's part of, uh, he heads the majority here. He called them the majoritarians against his rival Julius Martov. Uh, Headed the minority. They called them the minoritarians. And so in Russian, majoritarians is Bolshevik, and minoritarians is Menshevik. But what's so interesting here, and what corroborates what you were saying, John, is Julius Martov, Lenin's rival, had this funny idea that all members of the of the party should express themselves independently. And Lenin said, no, 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 absolutely not. The way the revolution is going to occur is the party leadership lays down the law, and everybody in the party obeys. So he was a strict authoritarian. And
Yeah.
I am no expert on what they call Marxism, Leninism, but I know a little bit. Certainly Marx, who is a figure in the history of philosophy. Marx envisioned this workers' revolution, and the working class would overthrow the owning class and establish a workers' dictatorship. But how that actually worked, in practice, well, Marx never really said. Would there be a workers' democracy, and they voted on these issues? No, nobody knows. But Lenin had a very clear vision of how communism was going to be imposed. It was going to be imposed by a cadre of party leaders who laid down the law. They expressed what the Communist Party was going to stand for, and everybody else in the party had to simply fall into line and obey. So, I mean, what Lenin contributed here was if it's a contribution, was the idea, that the leaders of the party dictate, everybody else obeys. Strict authoritarianism in the Leninist model.
And I think that this Leninist Marxism is, in large part, goes back to the radicalization of Lenin. So his father dies when he's 15 in 1886, and his loved. He to the extent that he loved anyone, I think he loved his brother Alexander. He called Sasha, and Sasha was a science major at the university, and he had joined this leftist movement. Now, Tsar Alexander III, was a very reactionary czar in Russia, and he posed any sort of limits to his own autocratic rule. And so he joins this leftist revolutionary movement, and they hatch this plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. Sasha is chosen to build a bomb, the science guy. The plot is foiled, and he's the fall guy. He takes full blame for it, and he's hanged in 1886. So on top of the pain of losing his father in January, Lenin then loses his brother in May, 5 months later. And not only is he in pain over that, but his family is just shunned by the locals. And so Lenin really just takes a nosedive into leftist politics. He picks up his brother's favorite book, What Is to Be Done by Nikolai Chernyshevsky. And Chernyshevsky, a generation earlier, had turned to the French utopian socialists. What is to be done? What is to be done in Tsarist Russia? His answer to that question relied heavily on Robespierre, Maximilien Robespierre, and the Jacobin-led reign of terror during the French Revolution. And Chernyshevsky, in this very, very influential book, advocated collectivism, self-sacrifice, violent revolution. He thought that he said, men were cut off from the full life of organic and physical or psychical unity. and that one had to merge himself with the collective and sacrifice in order to achieve this collective good. And I've got a few quotes from Chernyshevsky that I think really shed a lot of light on Lenin's trajectory as we call him here, the master of terror. And here he is learning from Chernyshevsky, who's taking his lessons from the Jacobins during the very, very bloody reign of terror in France. So he wrote, "The appearance of strong personalities has a decisive influence on history. They impose their character on the direction of events. The new type has been born. It does not matter what one thinks of them. Whatever they say will be obeyed by all. The mass is simply the raw material for political experiments. Whoever rules it tells it what to do, and it obeys. Only the axe can save us, and nothing but the axe. Summon Russia to take up the axe." I mean, this stuff it couldn't be clearer. He's calling for bloody, violent revolution. And this is
the
Lenin's
axe,
leftist textbook.
Not even with guns,
Yeah.
but with the axe. I mean, my God, you're talking about barbarism and savagery. That was written in the mid 19th century. He could have said,
Yeah.
with guns and stuff. But I don't think it's accidental. He's calling for bloody revolution with axes. We're gonna axe the bourgeoisie into pieces. I mean, just the barbarism of it. It's just And by the way, in Rwanda in '94, the Rwandan genocide. I mean, the favored weapon was machetes, and they hacked the Hutu tribes. Often hacked the Tutsi members into pieces with machetes and stacked their body parts like so much firewood. I mean, it's just that's calling for. That's the imagery that comes to mind. We're talking about rebelling with axes. I mean, my God, what a caveman mentality that is. But just a second, John. Before you go on, I just wanted to say something. Marx himself, talks about the masses and individuals, don't really contribute that much. Like nobody really invents anything on the Marxist view. It's just all different members of society contribute to it. Remember, it reminds me of Obama's line. You run this business or something. You didn't build that. All of society is responsible for it. That's the Marxist view. But here, this guy is a sick version of individualism. He's talking about this is what is known as the great man theory of history. These great men rise up and they take control of the masses and they impose their will on the masses and they buy a bunch of axes. It's not funny. And we go out and we just perpetrate mayhem. We chop the owning class members into pieces. So he's you're right. Lenin's a fascinating version of Marxist because he has this version of the great man theory of history. Well, there's few individuals are going to rule the masses and bend them to his will. And Lenin certainly did that. The rule of the initiated party elite. The few.
Yeah.
Not
sort of
the many.
The Nietzschean view of the Superman who, is willing to basically do anything to put forward his own will, and he's never to question really the source of that will. He's not to reason with himself and to figure out, okay, does this actually make sense? No, that would be weakness. So one has to be driven by this sort of urge, and in this case, an urge to kill. And Chernyshevsky was incredibly explicit about this. And he said that we have to be more consistent than the great Jacobin terrorists of 1792. We must destroy all of our enemies possible by any means. And Lenin read this book 5 times over the summer of 1887. It was his brother's favorite book. And he, like I said, he just nosedived into this leftist political theory. He soon after discovered Marx, and he spends basically the next decade rising among Russian and European socialists, writing and distributing pamphlets among workers, until finally he's caught again, I should say, in 1897. He's exiled to a small town in Siberia, and it's oh wow, this is terrible. Like, of course, Tsarist Russia was terrible, and to the extent that it was authoritarian, it was bad. But this experience would be nothing like what Lenin himself would later doom others to.
Right.
He's caught, he's exiled, he's given time to put his affairs in order. His mother and sister are allowed to accompany him on the train. He's put up in this hut and allowed to continue to correspond with his communist associates. And even a little bit later, his girlfriend Nadia, who was a communist school teacher, she was exiled, and she lies and says that they're engaged, and she's actually allowed to go live with him. They soon get married, and they spend their time here in political exile, writing and translating socialist works. So it's just
Yeah, yeah, you're right. That's an important point. I was gonna make that too, but you already hit it. Just let me reiterate. There's no doubt that the Tsar, the Romanov dynasty, was brutal. They were Europe's. You know, is Russia part of Europe? I don't know, but often considered part of Europe. Uh, Western Russia, I suppose, is part of Europe. Anyhow, the Romanov dynasty was the most brutal, brutal monarchy in Europe. There's no doubt about that. But you're raising a good point. He's arrested, and charged with sedition, and but before he comes to trial, he's in prison for a year, and he spends that time writing and theorizing. They, they like you said, they exile him to Siberia for 3 years. And his mom and sister accompany him. I think, you're absolutely right, Sean. What the communists later did, Lenin and Stalin, sending people off to gulags, slave labor camps where they'd be dead in a matter of months. You don't get to ask the communists, well, can mommy come along? Can mommy accompany me on the,
oh my
on the
gosh,
on the voyage on the voyage on the trip to Siberia. So you're absolutely right. The czars
yeah,
were brutal monarchs, but the communists were worse by many orders of magnitude. And I've
yeah,
seen the difference, captured sometimes when the czar and various kings are called, military dictators are called authoritarian regimes, and the communists and national socialists are called totalitarian regimes. And I think there is a difference there in degrees of brutal political, dictatorship. And one difference, of course, is under the authoritarian regimes, the borders are often open, for people, for dissidents who want to get out, who want to leave. Whereas under a totalitarian regime, the borders are closed, and you cannot get out. And you're caught there. You're trapped, by
yeah.
the
I
communists.
thought,
So
yeah. I mean, for a good A and B comparison, think about Lenin's experience and compare that, if you want a literary rendition, with probably one of the saddest scenes ever rendered in literature, in We the Living. You've got to go read that book if you haven't already. It just celebrated, what was it, the 70th anniversary, or was it the 80th? Now I'm forgetting. But
it
there's
was it was
the
published in the
scene,
1930s. So
1936, 2001, 85th anniversary, right? Um,
right,
yeah,
right.
I'm probably getting my dates off on, but we just celebrated an anniversary of this publication, is the point. And there's a scene in that book where two young people are sentenced to hard labor camps in Siberia, and the camps that Lenin, as we'll see, set up. And just to compare the contrast here between Lenin's story and that story. If you read the book, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, I don't want to spoil it. So you'll know what I'm talking about when you come to it.
Right, right. It's heartbreaking scene, with this young couple in love. You're absolutely right. Ayn Rand, who grew up under the communists, tells that story brilliantly. And if somebody, protests, well, that's fiction. Well, could refer them to Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The Gulag
Well,
Archipelago
in,
was
in
not
fact,
fiction.
that story in We the Living was based on fact. Fact as relayed to Rand while she was living in the U.S. via her mother in letters. And there's an essay about this in Essays on We the Living, which you've got an essay in. So if you're interested in seeing the factual basis of many of the background stories in We the Living, you can see it there.
Right. No, absolutely right. But to get back to the Gulag Archipelago for just for just a minute. Solzhenitsyn, was a Soviet dissident who was imprisoned in the gulags, and he gave us a firsthand account of the brutality of it. And the one takeaway from the Gulag Archipelago that I remember was cattle prods. Whereas the communist guards using cattle prods that in civilized country are used on cattle, give it electric shock to cattle to get these animals to move. They're using them on human prisoners to get them, to brutalize them, to work in slave labor. So, Lenin's sitting in his hut with his wife, writing letters to his communist buddies and reading books and translating these socialist tracts into Russian. And the regime that he sets up imposes vastly greater brutality on their political enemies. So I can think of the Tsar by analogy. John, the czarist brutality is like what would be a good example? Maybe you have emphysema, and maybe you die from it, and maybe you survive. But with the communist brutality is Ebola. It's so virulent you're dead in a couple of days. So yeah, there's degrees of brutality, degrees of evil. The communists, along with the Nazis, win any awards for degrees of evil. They are the most egregious mass murderers of history. And Lenin initiates this, as we'll see when we get to that point in his story.
Yeah,
he's certainly
the mastermind. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we should, since his name was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, that was the family name. We should at least mention where Lenin came from. Nobody knows for sure, at least from what I've read, but they think he might have adopted the name from the river Lena or Lena. What is it? Lena, which is a river in Siberia. But I don't know. I haven't read where anybody knows for sure. Where or why Lenin chose that name, that pseudonym. You have any?
Yeah,
did you come across?
No, I read the same thing, that he adopts it in 1901, shortly after leaving Siberia, and that it might be linked to that. I think there's more definite accounts of Stalin, because if I recall correctly, Stalin's also a pseudonym and has something to do with steel. Hard as steel. But Lenin, right. It's a little bit more gray. But we do know that he adopted that name in 1901. And shortly after, in 1902, publishes a pamphlet titled, like Chernyshevsky's book, What is to be Done? And herein, he's advocating for this vanguard communist party to take over. And here comes the schism that you mentioned earlier between various communist socialists, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks led by Julius Martov. And they label Lenin, very justly so, and we've got to give them some credit here, socialists though they were, they labeled Lenin an autocrat and a despot. And this was going to be borne out in the next few years, because Lenin found, party membership fees are not enough to keep the Bolsheviks going. So what are we going to do? And he tells his goons to start robbing banks and post office right. and trains. And
it's not funny, right?
They're robbing all these people just so that they can keep their party, afloat. And he's then needs to evade arrest and ends up in Zurich, which I think is the,
right.
Goes to Zurich and really loves it there.
Too bad he didn't stay there. But you're right. The bank robbing, one of the famous incidents for that was under Stalin, who robbed the state bank in Tiflis in Georgia in 1907. And you're right about Stalin. He came from Georgia. His last name is just, to me, is unpronounceable. I don't even remember what his family name was. But Stalin, he took this Stalin, for a mass murderer is a good name, because you're right, it has something to do with steel. He's like the Superman was always the man of steel, and then Stalin was pushing his name forward that way as he was, like he was made of steel. John, one story I've read over the years that I don't know if it's true or apocryphal, but that Lenin, his Stalin, whose name has become synonymous with brutality and mass murder, and justly so, another worthy subject for the villain show, that in his youth, under Lenin's tutelage, Lenin criticized him for being too soft on class enemies. He had to be harsher. So, oh wow, is this guy was, Stalin was too soft for Lenin. Well, was too merciful. Well, that tells us, if that story is true, and it may well be, that tells us something about Mr. Ulyanov.
Yeah.
What a brutal guy he was. So, before we talk about overthrowing the Kerensky regime and in the October
Mm.
Revolution and everything, we should mention one of Lenin's books. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, which was what,
Yeah.
1917.
Yeah. This
And
comes about, in World War One, which, if not for World War One, Lenin probably would have been a minor footnote in the books of history. World War One devastates Russia, and uh, the book you're mentioning is the one in which Lenin labels this a war of the imperialist capitalists, and he wants to transform it into this proletarian revolution instead.
right, right. And you said before that some people consider Lenin a formidable intellect, and perhaps amongst politicians that may be that may be accurate. Certainly, he was intelligent, educated, and evil. And when
Yeah.
somebody's evil and brutal, as Lenin was, the more intelligent you are, the more educated you are. That simply the more dangerous that makes you. But we should talk about imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, which became, like a Bible to communists and various socialist anti-capitalists. Lenin argues that imperialism, this military conquest of foreign lands, is driven by the capitalist system. That the capitalist system needs, new markets and cheap labor and raw materials, and imperialism is the way that the capitalist countries gain those things. And this is 1917, John. I just want to critique this for a second. It's like Lenin never heard of international free trade, you know, you know, and he never recognized something that Adam Smith had pointed out in 1776, a long time before Lenin was ever born, in Wealth of Nations, that it's even aside, and don't forget, Adam Smith was a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow. And
Mm-hmm.
we did a hero show on Adam Smith with Eamon Butler, which I thought was the head of the Adam Smith Institute in London. But Professor Smith really was insightful, and he pointed out the worst thing about imperialism is in warfare is the bloodshed, the moral problem, endless bloodshed and the killing, and and it says you occupy some country, you have to put down endless number of indigenous uprisings, and it's endlessly bloody. So that's the worst thing about it. But even from an economic standpoint, Adam Smith pointed out, it's a lose. It's much less expensive to simply trade with countries for the raw materials you need, and so forth, than it is to raise an army, raise a navy, conquer the country, keep having to feed the army and navy because you're going to keep having to fight down indigenous uprisings and everything. It's an enormous, imperialism is an enormous economic lose for the capitalist countries relative to the policy of international free trade, which Lenin should have known, having lived in London for a while. That was the policy. Britain, one of the most capitalist countries in the world, international free trade was the policy that the British followed, and their leading politicians, John Bright, Richard Cobden, William Gladstone. That's what they stood for, was free trade. And the push towards imperialism in Britain and everywhere always came from the aristocrats. Always historically, conquest. We gained power and wealth by conquest, not by productivity and trade. So Lenin's book is completely wrong. I mean, he's completely flawed, on this. And by the way, Thomas Sowell, really another someone we venerated properly on the Hero Show. Thomas Sowell's book on Marxism, he just dissects Lenin's book brilliantly. So I strongly recommend it. Nevertheless, communists and socialists aren't known for their commitment to reality. They live in this Marxist delusional world, and so in the delusional world of Lenin and his followers, including to this day, capitalism is leads to imperialism for the reasons that we state. He's just completely mistaken on this, John.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, capitalist is the system based on individual rights, and imperialism is to violate rights. Is to initiate force against other nations in this case, and to take their wealth and resources. And who needs to do this? Rand points this out. Ayn Rand wrote a great column called War and Peace, a short column published in 1962, in which she just very clearly, quickly shows that it's not the free producers who need to raise armies and march into countries and take stuff. It's the people who have devastated their means of production, who don't have anything, who need to march in and take stuff. And so
Yeah, and
um, yeah.
historically, Ayn Rand is right. Adam Smith was right. It's not the businessmen, who lead countries into warfare, conquest, and imperialism. They recognize that's not the way you profit. You by devastating factories, and farmlands and towns. This is not the way we profit. We profit by productivity and trade. Like I said, in Britain, it was the aristocrats, not the bourgeoisie, not the middle class entrepreneurial, business class that pushed for imperialism. It was Benjamin Disraeli who was the leader of the conservatives, of the aristocrats, who pushed for imperialism. Not William Gladstone, the liberal, leader of the business interests. In the United States, what little push towards imperialism there came from people like Teddy Roosevelt, who was scornful of business and thought that warfare made a man out of you, and this is what we need to strengthen the American characters. We got to go conquer Spanish possessions and stuff. It wasn't the business interests that pushed for Ayn Rand's right about that productivity and free trade. That's how we profit. But Lenin had no understanding of this. He's living in a Marxist delusional world. And we should comment on this for a second. I think we did when we dissected Marx. But the essence of Marxism, and Lenin, of course, as a Marxist necessarily accepts it, is the idea of inveterate class warfare. That's like hardwired into reality. That there's this struggle between the owning class and the working class. And any honest person who looks out, at the real world in the capitalist country would go, what? What are you talking about? Where did I get my first job as a kid in Brooklyn? At McDonald's. It was a wealthy corporation, huge profit-driven, wealthy business. I'm a 17-year-old kid with no marketable skills, whatever. And McDonald's hired me, and what did I do for them? I swept the floors, I mopped the floors, and eventually they gave me on the job training. It taught me how to, work the grill, work the cash register, and everything. And I started to acquire some skills. And I started to build a resume. That I was a hard worker. When I went years later, I went for a better job. I give my boss at McDonald's as a reference. And I said, oh yeah, this kid is he's a good kid. He's a hard worker. There's no inveterate struggle between me, this 17-year-old kid with no money whatsoever, in a wealthy corporation like McDonald's. It's ridiculous. It's just flat out false, and it's a delusion. It's a secular delusion. Marxism is a secular delusion akin to religion, and Lenin's just caught up in this delusional world like all Marxists are.
Yeah, and he gets really lucky. He gets this big break essentially with World War I, the Great War. And I really do think that we wouldn't know about Lenin today if not for World War One, because what it does is it devastates Russia and it leaves it, with very little resources to support itself. There are food shortages, protests over these food shortages, much like the French Revolution, by the way. And Nicholas II, who's Tsar at this time, abdicates among these food shortages and leaves the road clear for whoever's going to take it. And so pretty much for the next 7 months, Russia is ruled by this Russian Republic with Alexander Kerensky as president. And, then in October, we get what I would call the Monty Python of revolutions, the most ridiculously farcical, disorganized revolution to ever actually do anything. Uh, People leading it, Trotsky's at the head, and this is just total incompetence. And it really only succeeds because Kerensky's government was even more incompetent. And the great majority of people at this point really didn't care. They were worried about whether or not they were going to have bread to eat tomorrow. Kerensky had tried to bring in people to guard the Winter Palace where he was residing, where the ministers were, and most of them didn't want to go out and kill their fellow Russians, and they didn't really see the political difference between one and the other. They didn't see how bad things were about to get, and so it's just one thing after another. The Bolsheviks take over the Peter and Paul Fortress. They take over the bridges. They take over the train stations. But they have yet to take over the Winter Palace, where Kerensky and the government is, and Kerensky's not backing down. He's not just going to hand it over. So they've got the Peter and Paul Fortress on the north side of the Neva, looking down with its guns on the Winter Palace, and they've got these museum piece guns that are sitting there that nobody knows how to work. And so they decide, okay, well, we're going to wheel in some new guns, and they bring in the new guns, and then they can't find the shells for these things. They need special 3-inch shells. They can't find them. They finally do, and then they find out, oh, well, these guns don't have any sights on them. So what are we going to do? We're just going to shoot blindly. And so then they decide, well, we need to put up a red lantern to declare the insurgency. So somebody goes out to find a red lantern. They can't find one anywhere. Comes back with a purple lantern, and then he can't figure out how to get this thing up the pole. So they just decide, oh, screw it. We'll just start shooting. And they shoot like 36 shells at the Winter Palace, and only about 3 of them actually hit the palace. But that apparently is enough to scare the people inside. And when the Red Army finally shows up to go in and arrest the ministers in there, they find the place that is essentially unguarded. And, it's been told for decades that this October Revolution was this epic quest for freedom. But in fact, it was like a regular night in Petrograd. People were going to the theaters and the nightclubs. The workers in the factory, for whom Lenin was supposedly throwing off this yoke of oppression, had no idea what was actually happening. It's really funny. Lenin biographer Victor Sebastian said of there's a 1928 film by Sergei Eisenstein just called October, and it's about this revolution. And Sebastian, who's looked into this, said that there were far more people that were employed as extras in the film than took part in the real revolution. So you just have this farcical revolution that really, it begins with lies and deceit and incompetence, and just continues. I mean, this is the sign of things to come for the Soviet regime.
Yeah, and too bad it didn't continue in its Monty Python style, in perpetuity. In a way, it did, in the way that the communists handled the economy, and of course, it just tanked, and initiated or instigated mass starvation. But unfortunately, the communists were competent at one thing, and that was mass murder. And they brutalized when they were in power. That they put into practice what you were talking about before, the terror. They brutalized their enemies. And John, I just so happened to have a copy of this book here with me, but just by some accident, I found it in my library. How do we get it? How do we?
The Black Book of Communism: Crimes, Terror, Repression by Stéphane Courtois and Nicholas
Right.
Worth.
The subtitle is perfect, right? Crimes, Terror, Repression. And I strongly recommend this book to anybody who wants to know the history and the reality of communism, because it was based on archives. This was research that Western researchers did in the archives, to some degree in the Soviet Union, although most of the Soviet archives or the KGB archives have not been plumbed, and I don't think under Putin, any Western researchers are going to get a chance to investigate anytime soon. But also from the East European communist regimes that are now, much freer countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, for example. And I just want to read a couple of passages here from the Black Book of Communism. And like I said, this was here. This is written by Martin. The foreword to the book, written by Martin Malloy, if I remember correctly, he's an American historian and expert on communism. But the book's second point is that there never was a benign initial phase of communism before some mythical wrong turn threw it off track. From the start, Lenin expected, indeed wanted, civil war to crush all class enemies, and this war, principally against the peasants, continued with only short pauses until 1953. So much for the fable of good Lenin, bad Stalin.
Mhm.
And now, one more passage here from the chapter from the section on the Soviet Union written by Nicholas Wirth. We're talking about the early years under Lenin. And some of these the names of some of these Russian towns to me are unpronounceable, but I'll do the best I can. A recurring theme in numerous articles in Bolshevik newspapers in Odessa, Kiev, Kharkiv. How do you say this one? Well, it's just
Skip it.
Ekaterinoslav or something like that, as well as in Perm, Ural, and Nizhny Novgorod, was the humiliation of bourgeois women who were forced to clean toilets or the barracks of the Cheka secret police or Red Guards. But this was merely the toned down and politically presentable face of the much more brutal reality of mass rape, which, according to innumerable statements, took on gigantic proportions, particularly in the second reconquest of Ukraine and the Cossack regions of the Crimea in 1920. The logical culmination of the extermination of the bourgeoisie as a class, the execution of prisoners, suspects, and hostages imprisoned simply on the basis of their belonging to the possessing classes, is recorded in many of the cities taken by the Bolsheviks. In Kharkiv, there were between 2,000 and 3,000 executions in February to June 1919, and another 1,000 to 2,000 when the town was taken again in December. In Rostov-on-Don, approximately 1,000 executions in January 1920. In Odessa, 2,200 in May to August 1919, then 15 to 100, 3,000 to 3,000 between February 1920 and February 1921. In Kiev, at least 3,000 in February to August 1919. And here's that unpronounceable town again, Ekaterinodar, I think is how you say it, John. In Ekaterinodar, at least 3,000 between August 1920 and February 1921. In Armavir, a small town in Kuban, between 2,000 and 3,000 in August to October 1920. The list could go on and on, unquote,
Yeah.
from the Black Book of Communism. Lenin gleefully supported class warfare to wipe out anybody who could even remotely be considered a class enemy. And as the Black Book points out, many of these victims were peasants. What did the peasants in Russia in 1919 own? They have like a small plot of land. These guys were not wealthy by any criterion. The Marxist view is so sick, John. The idea that if you hire me to work for you, you are exploiting me by the very fact of hiring me because you want to make money off of my work. So some peasant has like some small plot of land and he hires a poorer peasant to help him cultivate the crops. He's exploiting that peasant. We're going to kill him, and they did. And Lenin was very clear on that. We're going to kill anybody who owned anything, and anybody who hired anybody to work. So we got to go kill all those people at McDonald's for hiring me as a 17-year-old kid, giving me my first job. This is the Marxist
Yeah.
philosophy is just sick, and Lenin is just completely immersed in it, and he's just a brutal mass murderer.
Yeah, shortly after Lenin took over in 1918, still massive food shortages continued, and they would only get far worse. But Lenin blamed the kulaks, these farmers who owned 8 acres or more of land, supposedly the wealthy farmers. And he claimed that they were hoarding all this grain so that they could increase the prices of grain. So he ordered these armed groups to go in and take the grain and then bring it back to the cities for redistribution. And some of the correspondence that we do have from Lenin just shows that he delighted in terror and delighted in killing. He ordered the public hanging of 100 kulaks to demonstrate that he meant business. And so after this, he also requisitioned certain amounts of grain from these farms, basically taking it. And this, of course, disincentivizes production. So food shortages are exacerbated. There's this black market that crops up, and Lenin orders that anyone that's engaged in this food black market is just trying to feed themselves. He orders that these speculators and marketeers be shot. And he sets up the Cheka, which you mentioned, this emergency commission for
Police, yeah.
combating counter-revolution. Yeah, the secret police, the father organization of today's KGB. Lenin's legacy lives on. And the Cheka, one of the worst terrorist organizations, Cheka, KGB, and in all its various iterations, one of the worst terrorist organizations in history, kills millions. In Lenin's time, the blood on his hands is estimated somewhere around 140,000 deaths. But he sets up this system for Stalin to take over. A gigantic murder machine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Did I say deaths? Yes, murders.
Yeah, murders. Yeah. There's a great quote in the Black Book of Communism from Martin Latsis, who was one of Lenin's functionaries, in the secret police, where Latsis was telling his men, I might be able to remember it verbatim. We don't make war on any people in particular. Rather, we are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class, unquote. And that's much better, right? I mean, we're not Nazis, guys. We don't make war on ethnic groups or races. No. We're communists. We're exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. And Lenin absolutely was gleeful about this. There's also in the Black Book, Nicholas Wirth's section on the Soviet Union. There's also this, and again, I strongly recommend this book. Again, I want to center it here. There's this section where Lenin makes war on the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, Russia's a very religious country. And, a lot of people, especially amongst the peasantry, devoted to the Russian Orthodox version of Christianity. And the church, as churches, organized religions do, has a lot of money. And, of course, Lenin wanted it. And Lenin wanted to strip the Russian Orthodox Church of all of its wealth. And he declared war on the clergy. And he had his goons murder thousands of Russian Orthodox priests, monks, and nuns, and did it gleefully. I don't remember the quote offhand, but since so many people were obedient to the church, Lenin's quote was to the effect that if we kill a bunch of these, I don't remember what he called them, lice, whatever terminology he used. We kill a bunch of of these disgusting parasites, kill them like beetles. Then the masses will realize we mean business. And they'll obey. I mean, the Russian Orthodox Church was certainly faith-based, authoritarian. Basically got its money from the masses by all kinds of duplicitous means, promising them, salvation in heaven, and getting these poor people to donate, to the church. So the church is certainly, an evil organization. But Lenin is more evil by many orders of magnitude. I mean, we're just going to kill these clergy, including nuns. We're just going to kill thousands of them to break the back of the church and to show all these Christians in the country who follow the church, that we're the power now, not these stupid faith-based parasites. Yeah, he was absolutely ruthless.
They killed somewhere between 14,000 and 20,000 people associated with the church. And I forget the name of the priest, but there was a priest who, in the midst of this great food shortage, told other churches, sell off your valuables and use that money to help the poor, help those in need, help those that are dying of starvation. And so they began doing this. And Lenin, of course, loved this, but then he went ahead and ordered that the government go into these churches and take their valuables and begin selling them off to feed people, or not to feed people, who knows. But yeah, yeah. I mean, it just boggles the mind how immoral a leader this guy was, and how he somehow rose to this incredible position of power, instituted many different organizations for killing and enslaving people. The Cheka, of course, was the counter-revolutionary secret police. But then they needed a place to send all these supposed criminals. So shortly thereafter, he sets up the Gulag to run these forced labor camps in Siberia. And by 1920, there were 84 camps. It's something like 50,000 prisoners. That would go up to 70,000 just in the next few years. And these, the people that are free are starving. You can imagine they're not going to be trucking a bunch of food into these camps to feed these people. No, they're forced to labor in these camps and die in these camps. And this is, the numbers of people murdered by Lenin and his goons is just staggering.
Yeah, yeah, and then the ones who died from starvation that the communists initiated, because whatever his intelligence level was, Lenin was an inveterate Marxist, and he's crippled by that philosophy. So when they take over the country, they kill off the owning class. So they kill off the peasants who were the most agriculturally productive, and who then is put in charge of the agricultural sector? Marxist ideologues. You've killed off the people who know how to grow food, and you put people in. The criteria of selection is, one, do they know Marxism, and two, are they loyal to me, Lenin? Are they loyal to the Communist Party? And similarly, in any industry, the steel industry, or whatever industry it is, you kill off the owners who are the ones who know. Andrew Carnegie's in effect, of the steel industry, the ones who know how to produce steel, and you put in Marxist intelligentsia in charge. And they don't know the first thing about steel production. And so the economy tanks, mass starvation takes over. We didn't even know how many people starved to death, because of this. In addition to the deliberate murders, that Lenin instigated. And then the gulags. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The gulags, they're in Siberia, first of all. It's under Lenin and later under Stalin. Slave labor camps. It's brutally cold. You're getting very little to eat, very little medical attention. You're being worked to death, and the life expectancy for even a young, healthy, robust person being sent to the Siberian gulags was not very long. But the Lenin, Stalin didn't have to worry about that. They had an endless supply of class enemies, and if the people weren't class enemies, they just accused them of being class enemies and sent them off to the gulags. You had an endless supply of slave labor. So yeah,
Yeah.
so this is, along with National Socialism, this is the most one of the two most brutal political systems in human history.
Yeah. And did you know this? This is one of the most bizarre things to me. But when he died in 1924, Lenin's Lenin's body was preserved and remains on display in Lenin's mausoleum in Red Square in Moscow. You can go see this body. It's almost
Yeah,
a hundred years since he died. 97 years since he died. And you could still go see
oh
his
yeah,
body there.
that's a must see trip, John, on my
Oh,
sightseeing tour. We
geez.
gotta we gotta go see Lenin's the preserved body of one of history's most egregious mass murderers. Definitely, yeah, definitely want to see that. One last point that I want to make here: the contrast with the Nazis, with the National Socialists. Hitler, maybe he learned something from the communists, or maybe he was just a little more cunning than the communists. But there's quotes attributed to him, which may be apocryphal, but it captures the essence of what National Socialism was all about. When Hitler was contrasting the Nazis with the communists, he said, "We don't nationalize banks and industries. We nationalize bankers and industrialists." Now it was something like that. The quote itself is, it may be apocryphal, but it captures accurately the essence of National Socialism, and that is we recognize we want the guys who are the communists who just kill the bankers and put in Marxists in charge of the banking industry. That's not going to work. We want the bankers, their expertise. We want them running the banking industry. We want the steel industrialists running the steel factories. We want the leading agricultural, the grain producers running their farms and everything. But in effect, we dictate to them what they got to do, or we'll kill your whole family. So what the Nazis will do is they'll take your family and stick them in a concentration camp, and then you work for the state. This factory doesn't belong to you anymore; it belongs to the state. You do what the state tells you, or we'll kill your family, and we'll kill you, and put your assistant in charge. So the Nazis were a little more intelligent in running the economy than maybe they had learned from the disaster that Lenin had instigated in the Soviet Union. But either way, it's just the Nazis or the communists, take your pick. There's one story, John, about this town in Poland that I've heard, which where the Nazis and the communists were fighting over it during the Second World War. They went back and forth, with who controlled it. And they said when the Nazis took over, they found anybody with a high school diploma what was it? The communists took over. They found anybody with a high school diploma. They took them out behind the barn and shot them. When the Nazis took over, they found anybody with a high school diploma. They took them out in the center square and shot them. So the communists maybe were a little more discreet. That was the difference between them. But yeah, Lenin. We have to comment on the myth again. There's still educated people to this day who believe that Lenin was basically a benign despot who wanted to improve conditions for the working class and the poverty-stricken in Russia, and Stalin was the one who turned the Soviet Union into a brutal one-party dictatorship. And there's a technical word in the field of philosophy for that belief, John. It's called bullshit. Lenin was the one who established the one-party brutal dictatorship, and Stalin learned from him. That's the truth.
Stalin did, and really Hitler did as well. Stalin said the state is an institution built up for the sake of exercising violence. Previously, this violence was exercised by a handful of money bags over the entire people. Now we want to exercise violence or organize violence in the interests of the people. But as I said earlier, Lenin constantly forecasting these violent uprisings of the proletarians, but more often than not, he was having to fight rebellions against himself, against his own party, his own government. So certainly one of the worst mass murderers in history, a vital topic for study today. Many people in the left movement today are going back to Lenin's books, and like you said, they've got this false view, this just outrageous view that Lenin was this benign intellectual that sort of stepped the stage, and it was Stalin who turned the gears of the killing machine and has the blood on his hands. But no, I mean you can't erase the facts here, and the facts are that Lenin he created the killing machine, this master of terror, created it and put it into Stalin's hands essentially.
Right. So, Lenin was a brutal, bloody class warrior. I mean, the history on this is very clear to somebody who's honest and paying attention. Again, the Black Book of Communism, based in to some extent in the archives, research into the archives in the Soviet Union is very clear on this. I always thought, the Marxist inveterate class warfare and the bloody desire to destroy the bourgeoisie. And what that quote was talking about, the way they humiliated the bourgeois women. Make them scrub the toilets of the secret police, then mass gang rape these women, then a bullet in the back of her skull, and then throw her into a mass grave. I mean, is that necessary to further the interests of the working class? Yeah, I don't think so. That is simply brutal rage directed against people who have more than me, against the owning class. And, in Russia under the Tsar, and under any aristocracy, there's people who get wealth by power, by being hereditary aristocrats and by cracking the whip on their serfs, their slaves, or, the lower classes. But Marx directed this against capitalism. Against capitalism, where people rise by their, in the free country, respect individual rights, where people rise by their own effort. Andrew Carnegie, the great example, right? Your rags to riches story. They're gonna do that to Carnegie and his wife. So I always thought Marxism is a philosophy of, for, and by envy-riddled, psychopathic wannabe mass murderers. That's Marxism. I think that's a nice description. It's a philosophy of, for, and by envy-riddled, psychopathic wannabe mass murderers. And Lenin fits that perfectly. They want to destroy the owning class, including in the free countries, where the owning class generally have worked hard and produced wealth in order to get the position and the money that they have.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it was not only Lenin's body that was preserved in Russia and in much of the world, but his spirit as well. I mean, that Cheka gave rise eventually to the KGB, which nurtured Putin, who is now in charge. And the very similar outlook. Maybe not as much blood on his hands, but who knows? The KGB's records are sealed. So I think that the
Right.
KGB has killed millions, and how many under Putin we don't know. But these ideas continue to animate that regime and to animate leftists the world over.
Yeah, like Antifa, in the United States, with their rioting endlessly with their signs, no war but class war. There's that the spirit of Lenin lives on. And you're right. Putin was a KGB guy. And under Yeltsin, the KGB files were accessible somewhat to Western researchers. Putin's not gonna reopen the file. So who knows how much blood Putin has on his hand, and the KGB generally. But they're brutal, secret police apparatus. But you're right. I suppose we could close with this, John. This, unfortunately, tragically, and terrifyingly, the terror lives on. The spirit of the terror, the spirit of Lenin lives on. Antifa is just one example in this country. Black Lives Matter also is a Marxist organization founded by Marxists, fighting class war and race war. They brought a Nazi element, into this. But the spirit of the terror lives on. Lenin's spirit lives on, unfortunately, and it remains for all good people, for all good rational people, to fight it, to stand up, intellectually and morally, and fight it. And as a devout atheist, I say thank God for Ayn Rand, because she gave us the philosophic and moral ammunition to fight these bad guys, to fight these villains.
Yeah, and for those in Russia who want to take a valuable first step, I think one would be figure out what political levers you need to pull to put Lenin's body in the ground with the worms where it belongs.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. All right. Well, on that note, I think we could say adieu to the villain show. It's not nearly as fun as the hero show, but in our world, it needs to be said a number of times. We need to identify who the villains are, why they're villains, and how much we need to fight them. And so to stand up, to fight against the bad guys, but mostly to live our lives rationally, to live them in a healthy, positive, productive way, and to achieve our values and achieve joy. In that spirit, John, I want to salute the heroes of the world, and I wish you a more heroic day, and have a heroic weekend, John, and everybody out there in Hero Land.
You too, Andy.